You know, when we think about presidential history, you tend to think of something static, as though Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, others, they've always been thought of the way we think of them today. But of course, that's not true, not even true by a long shot. Take Harry Truman, ended his presidency among the lowest approval ratings in Gallup history. Today, he is beloved. Richard Nixon resigned from office in disgrace, a presidential punchline. But at his funeral in 1994, he was actually widely praised for everything but Watergate. And sure, you say, well, you remember people fondly after their passings, but the fact of the matter is even George W. Bush, his approval ratings have gone up in the last 5+ years here, to the point here where their rivals not even exceed the sitting president. So why do impressions of presidents change so much, and which presidents should we be taking a second look at today? And to that first question, Yannick, why do things change so much since there's exhaustive coverage of presidents at the time from when they leave office to not even 20, 30 years later? Sometimes, as I mentioned with Bush, even 5 years later. Is it just human nature to feel more sympathetic to a person after time?
That's part of it. It takes a while to put things in perspective. From a scholarship standpoint, after documents become declassified and put into the presidential library and open for researchers start to uncover new things about a president, how much a president was working behind the scenes to shape things and to move an agenda forward. And these things sometimes don't seem obvious at the time.
You know, I think of guys, Jimmy Carter, and I think if he just had a public figure associated with Habitat for Humanity and some of the works that he's done, amazing works here for the underprivileged, not just in this country but around the globe, I think his statesman status would be so far up there. But he's involved himself. He's taken shots at sitting presidents when he doesn't agree with their policies, been very critical here, and I mean, had conversations with the Chavezes of the world, etc., that his approval rating hasn't gone up. And is that part of it? I mean, to his credit, George W. Bush hasn't said one iota of negative words about the person who succeeded him. Does that also, is it as much style as it is substance?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter is somebody who's known among presidents as being a little prickly to work with as a former president. I think there might be a case, domestically Carter's record is tough to defend because inflation went up considerably, 13% his last 2 years in office. In foreign policy, there might eventually be a case for revising Carter's reputation upward. He didn't preside over the prosperity part of the equation, but he had the peace part. And
he'll be defined by the hostage crisis no matter what.
Yeah, but he had the opening of China, recognizing China, the Panama Canal Treaty, some notable steps forward in defense, which usually Ronald Reagan is given credit for, like
Begin and Sadat and the three men framed in that picture. But give an idea to us which presidents had made the most marked change. We mentioned in the top President Truman, but there's other presidents who are thought of much differently now than when they left office in terms of increased stature.
Well, a classic case is Dwight D. Eisenhower, who at the time was seen as this uninformed president who would frequently go to press conferences and say he didn't know or didn't read the article, or would refer questions to cabinet officers. But after documents started becoming declassified, and I've been to the Eisenhower Library and looked at documents, it's very clear who was running cabinet meetings, and it's very clear how knowledgeable he was. There is even at least one incident where he was preparing with aides for a press conference, and he said to aides, if that question comes up, referring to a potentially very tricky question about China bombing 2 islands, he said, if that question comes up, I'll just confuse the reporters. I'll just confuse them. And he did. Question came up and he just mouthed this gibberish that was very difficult to follow. It was his way of avoiding a question. It detracted from his image at the time, but in retrospect we see him as somebody very shrewd for doing things like that.
But wouldn't Bill Clinton be at the top of the list of what Richard just mentioned?
In terms of peace and prosperity, Bill Clinton has had a very good record and running budget surpluses. His last few years in office was a tremendous achievement.
But think about how he polls now, Yannick. Right. To Dom's point, from when he left, if not in disgrace, close to it. Now he's thought of as arguably the most beloved Democrat that you have nationally, maybe with the exception of his wife. I mean, it's amazing how time has benefited the Clintons overall, and especially when we're talking presidents, about the man on the screen.
Yeah, he actually polled very well in his second term. He is the one president who had higher average approval ratings in his second term than his first. It's a real anomaly. And a lot of it was because of the economic prosperity. You had the growth of the internet, which really revolutionized the economy. So
Al Gore invented that, by the way.
he really benefited from that. And Al Gore ran a close race because of that. I think, you know, in terms of popular vote, he won the 2000 election.
How about the big losers? How about the folks who at the time well thought of, and now history may judge them a little more harshly?
Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, is probably the classic case. For decades, even close to a century, historians saw him as an average president, or a valiant president who fought off the corrupt radical Republican regimes. That view started to change in the 1960s with the modern civil rights movement, where historians really started to put a spotlight on his racism, how he tried to thwart this one moment where African Americans could achieve some progress after the Civil War. And so historians now see him as a failure, not as an average president, but a downright failure.
You know, two presidents I can think of who their supporters still love them today, and their opponents feel just as strongly embittered by them on different sides of the aisle. Ronald Reagan, more recently, and FDR before him. You look to conservatives today who think the New Deal was the worst thing ever, and his supporters who say if only there was an FDR. And conversely, people look at Reagan, he's the patron saint for conservatives, and yet progressives and many economists look at some of the math that he handed down, and it was the beginning of some of the runaway deficits that we've seen here. It's funny, those two guys, you know, they're still huge figures in presidential history, but they haven't moved people on other sides of the aisle one way or the other.
Two tremendously polarizing presidents, Reagan and FDR. They have acolytes who love them and detractors who absolutely hate them. And Reagan will always be defined by the increase in budget deficits, a tripling of the debt while he was in office, but also by a positive legacy with the Soviet Union and his meetings with summits with Mikhail Gorbachev, signing the INF treaty with Gorbachev, a decrease in inflation while he was president, but also on the negative side, Iran-Contra, and increase in inequality in the country. FDR, for decades, FDR is seen and taught by history professors and teachers as one of the three great presidents. In recent years, and I mean after the Cold War, there's been a lot of scholarship that has taken away from the sheen of the FDR record and focused on things like internment of Japanese Americans, his failure to do things in civil rights for African Americans, and particularly his health and his leadership in World War II, the Yalta Accords, where he really did not care much about what happened to Eastern Europe, and the fact that he was, in the words of historian Robert Farrell, a dying president his last years in office, who could only concentrate for about an hour or two per day on the president. So a very significant, important president, leader during the Great Depression and World War II, but recent scholarship has started to chip away at the edifice of his record.
Now, when we come back, everybody, we'll continue our conversations on the presidents, and he went from Watergate to foreign policy expert in a generation. Which presidents should we be re-examining even more than maybe the general public does? We'll be right back.